Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 17th of October 2023. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome, and thanks very much for spending some of your Tuesday evening with me and also with Cameron, who I'll bring in just a second. Just before I do that, let me just remind you, as I always do, that with regard to what we say on the channel here, we don't provide specific financial or legal or property advice. We do moderate the chat, but encourage you to throw your comments in. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to throw those in too. This is at the 17th of October 2023, if you're watching a replay. And if you'd like to specifically ask a question or get my attention, if you use that Walk the World, that'll make sure that I see it in my queue. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you can, if you like, get your question top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do here. Without further ado, let me bring Cameron in. Cameron, hello. Great to see you again.
G'day, Martin. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back on. So much to talk about. And we were talking just before we went live. You sort of left the mothership, University of Sydney, and you're now very much setting out on your own as an independent economist with all the excitement and opportunity that can create.
Yeah, exactly. No, just thought I'd give myself a couple of years to see what I can create independently. Turning my Fresh Economic Thinking newsletter, where I put most of my commentary out, so fresheconomicthinking.com, trying to sort of roll that into a one-man think tank consulting outfit in 2024. But before that happens, I need to get my new book out, which is called The Great Housing Hijack, and that'll come out in February next year. So yeah, there are new and exciting things happening, and if you want to keep up to date, subscribe at fresheconomicthinking.com and get my weekly newsletter in your inbox, and you'll find out everything.
Yeah, and you're busy on Twitter as well, which is great, because that's where I get quite a lot of your fantastic charts. And this particular chart, if I can locate it, let me just make sure I get the right one. I think it's this one. No, it's not. Hang on, let me just push the right button. Sorry, it's that one. Missed. So you created a speculative index for Australian housing, and you made the point that the speculative index is rising. Now this gets us into a significant conversation about housing and all those things. And I guess two questions. One is, what is the speculative index in the first place? But more importantly, what does it tell us?
Yeah, so the idea of this index is that it's a ratio of two yields. One is the mortgage interest rate, and one is the gross yield on residential property. So the first year's gross rent divided by the purchase price, and that's going to be, of course, a geographical average. And so that gives us sort of the passing yield of a property, and it's a ratio of that and the mortgage rate. So it's the mortgage rate divided by that yield. So for example, if the mortgage rate's 8% and you're getting a 4% gross yield, then the speculative index is 2. But if the mortgage rate's 4% and the gross yield's 4%, then the speculative index is 1. And what that means is essentially the higher the number, the more you're relying on capital gains to justify borrowing money at that rate and spending it on housing. Because if you're borrowing at 4% to get a 4% gross yield, you're not really relying on capital gains to justify paying that price to get that return. But if you're borrowing at 8% to get 4%, then you're really relying on capital gains to make that investment make sense. And what you notice historically in that chart is that the range is pretty much 1 to 2. So if the mortgage rate falls below the gross yield. So, for example, during COVID, we dropped the cash rate, and so we could borrow money. So this doesn't include the fixed rate mortgages, which were much cheaper during that time. But when the mortgage interest rate is 3% and the yield's 3%, well, the ratio is 1. And now the mortgage interest rate's 5.5 and the yield's 3%, so it's getting up towards 2. And what you see is a kind of, I've called it a pulse or a heartbeat of the property market, where you always seem to get this blow-off phase at the end where the market keeps churning over. People keep selling and buying when their interest rate's twice the yield. And I just put that out there to show that we're not quite there yet. And it would be weird to have a a massive correction before we hit that point. What would be more normal historically is for interest rates to rise a little bit more, or prices to rise a little bit more, to take that speculative index up to 2 before there's a big correction. And what's super interesting is that if you look at the 1880s land boom, and if you subscribe to my fresheconomicthinking.com newsletter, you will see I wrote about how there's always this surprise second phase to a property cycle where the yield doesn't seem to matter anymore. And what's really interesting is in 1886, it seemed like the land boom in Victoria had slowed down. So this was the great 1880s land boom in Australia after the gold rushes and things like that. And what happened was banks put their interest rates up to 6% and yields were down below 3%, and prices kept rising despite the high, interest rates being raised from 3 to 6% during that period. So it seems like it's not just a thing that's happened the last 30 or 40 years, but it does seem to also fit with, a century and a half ago as well.
And I guess one of the questions is Australia unique, or do we see in other countries? I'm thinking Canada or the UK, where I am now. Property has had a significant impact on those economies, but we seem to have an even bigger concentration in Australia.
I haven't produced this. You've just given me the great idea to try and find this data and look at the United States and Canada, for example. But I'm going to guess, based on other things I know about the history of the property cycles there, that it's pretty similar. I mean, if you look at Canada today, you can see the same sorts of issues with rising interest rates and declining rents. Australia and Canada are very much alike in that respect in terms of our addiction to property and our property cycles. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to just make an international comparison of that sort of property pulse, that heartbeat of when it seems overvalued and when it doesn't.
I think it would be worth doing, because I do think there are some commonalities. But, if I take the UK, for example, they actually dialed back their loan-to-value ratios and loan-to-income ratios that banks were allowed to lend at after the global financial crisis. So they said you couldn't lend more than 20% of mortgages at more than 4.5 times, for example. Now, that wasn't the same sort of tightness that would actually, compared with Australia, where there was none. Basically, you could, if you had a pulse, you could get a mortgage, and as rates went down, of course, you will be aware of the ratio of income to house prices, right? And it's more extreme in Australia almost than the West, because of the fact that the mortgage borrowing multiples got higher and higher and higher. So there seems to be something about the way that Australia does property, and particularly the amount of leverage that's driving it, which is a little bit different from some other places.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. Actually, doing this comparison internationally is kind of difficult, and I've written before about different property tax regimes change this dramatically, because if you're paying nearly 2% property tax like some US states, then you're not going to be buying property at a 3% yield, because you're only getting a 1% net yield, right? I'm just looking at some yields in the UK, and they look on average a little bit higher than Australia, the gross yield. But then again, perhaps the heating and the maintenance and council taxes and other things are higher there too. So I have to look a bit more historically. But yeah, the price to income ratio, look, I've gone off that as a measure of housing for a few reasons, and one of those is different sort of tax treatments change what asset prices should be worth, and different interest rate environments. So, if mortgage rates were 9 or 10% now, then a lower price to income ratio would be just as expensive to purchase than a higher one at 6% interest rate. So I think those sorts of comparisons are tricky both internationally and over time, because of the impact of taxes and interest rates that have sort of such dramatic price effects. But Australia, I think the post-COVID period has shown how we're not that unique. If you look at New Zealand, if you look at Canada, if you look around the world, everyone's sort of had similar economic responses to the low interest rate environment, to the stimulus handed out, and we saw prices rise everywhere. We've also seen rents adjust upwards globally in response to rising incomes and inflation. So maybe we're not that unique. I definitely think culturally we seem at the more extreme end in our sort of addiction to talking about property. I mean, look at us, we're talking about it. I could go to any barbecue in the country tonight and talk about it, and and everyone would want to listen.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't they?
Yeah. Now, one other question which I've got, I have a feeling that the superannuation structure we've got in Australia is now beginning to have a bit of an impact on property. Not least, for example, if you're a down trader, you can sell and extract significant equity, 300,000 or more, put it back into superannuation. And of course, there's also a debate as to whether superannuation entities should be involved in property more directly. So how do you see that sort of other, if you like, big iceberg, which I think the superannuation system is huge. How do you see that interplaying with property?
Yeah. I have a lot of opinions on superannuation, Martin, but the link with property is, I think, really interesting. It's around rising rents. So, for example, the focus on build to rent, so having corporate landlords getting tax breaks so that they can compete with investor landlords with small portfolios who want to negatively gear against their other income. That's become a huge thing. A few years back, it was the LNP proposing using your super to buy housing or for a deposit. So, the relationship between those two things is super interesting. And I guess how do I put it? There's a few related issues there. One is that super is already used to buy housing. So people with their self-managed funds buy houses, build to rent, buys houses now. And the other thing we don't think about much is that people can lump sum withdraw super when they retire to repay their mortgage or to, upgrade their house. So you can take your super lump sum, upgrade your house, and then get on the age pension, right, when you stop working. So super is already a financial gateway, or has a financial doorway into the property market. I think that's been around for a while. Is it that much different here than elsewhere? It's really hard to know, but I think what is different is that this policy shift today to this build to rent. So build to rent is where a corporate landlord essentially builds an apartment and owns and manages it and rents it all out. And the logic in Australia is that we have all this money in super that we have to put aside. Wouldn't it be great if we've got all this compulsory savings that we use that to build apartments for people and houses so we can rent them back from our own super accounts? Okay, there is a conflict there. There's a core economic conflict. The owner of these apartments, the super fund, wants to maximize the rent and maximize the value, right? But the person who has a super fund that's doing the build to rent wants the cheapest housing they can get. They want the lowest rent and the lowest price so that they can purchase. And so I don't think it solves any of the fundamental economic conflicts that sit at the heart of housing. It's just one of the latest fashionable ideas for different financing for housing. And in fact, if I tweeted today, the chat I hear in policy debates reminds me of the end of the 2000s boom, where we're always talking about shared equity and new financing arrangements and tiny homes, like buy less housing, borrow more, buy less of it with shared equity. That's what happens in this last blow-off phase of the boom, I think, when we've kind of given up on prices and rents falling. We go, let's get creative and buy less of a house, either a smaller one or less of the equity, and let's get creative and have various other entities fund it, which I think is kind of hilarious. But yeah, super for housing, as a general principle, I think it's totally fine. I don't know if you know, Martin, my view is we should have super for everything. We should just unwind the system and let people spend out of their super accounts, because for a huge proportion of people, they're going to be wealthier when they're retired and using their super than they are, for example, in their 20s and raising children. And yet we're forcing people to spend 10% of their income and defer it to later when they don't need it, when they need it now to buy a house and raise a family. So I think super for everything is probably a better solution than super for housing. But the concerns people have of using super for housing, I don't think are as bad as what they seem, because we're already doing it. And we already did it during COVID when people got $20,000 each, and so $40,000 as a couple, and used that. So I think there's already a hangover from that. So if you're going to do it anytime, you could do it now. But anyway, that's a bit of a mashup of my thoughts on super for housing and build to rent. I don't think it's going to make housing cheaper. However, whatever financial engineering we come up with, it may change the order at which households are able to go from being renters to home buyers, because certain households have more money in super than others. So they, when this changes, they can then jump the queue, so to speak, and buy a bit earlier. So yeah, a lot there.
Yeah, thanks. And my dogs have just decided to go off. There's a bit of noise in the background, which I apologize about. Luna, come here. Luna, come here. Sorry, this is real life. Yeah, we have a couple of big vans going past at the moment, and Luna likes to make a big noise when they go past, so I apologize for that. Now, the interesting thing about superannuation, and there was a conference up in Brisbane, right, last week, specifically on housing, right? And I was interested that the superannuation discussion was a big element there as part of this build to rent conversation. And of course, the government's created this new agency, and she was there, head of the agency, talking about all of these new levers they were going to pull. And I guess the question is it going to make much difference? And who are the winners and who are the losers?
Yeah. So that is Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz you're thinking of, I think, Martin. And she is the former CEO of Mirvac, which is a large Australian apartment developer, and one of the first movers in the build-to-rent sector in Australia. So they have two projects in Sydney. One's called LIV, and they sort of market that as a premium rental product. You get to rent off us, the corporate entity, with the gym package and the massage suite and, all the extra features. And they brag to their investors about how they can rent for 20% above the local market because they've got this premium build-to-rent product. So interestingly, the CEO of Mirvac, who was CEO last year, is now this year the head of the National Housing Supply Council, whatever it's called. It's a new version of a previous type of thing. And so there's going to be a bit of a focus there on build-to-rent and how to engineer the right tax breaks so that developers like Mirvac can, get the tax breaks, make the most of their sites, and have this asset that's going to, get 20% more than the market from these young professionals who want the sort of packaged housing deal. So yeah, it's a bit of a bizarre thing, but as I said, it doesn't solve the core economic conflict that the more corporate interests you have, the less easy it is to make housing cheaper through any policy. It's hard enough that 66% of households own their own home, and it's typically one of their biggest assets. So any policy change to make rents go down or prices go down is already politically difficult. And now we're going to foster a new corporate sector that has similar interests in high rents rather than low rents, and similar interests in only building if additional tax breaks come. So build to rent, there's nothing stopping anyone build to rent, and there never has been. And many large corporates and wealthy individuals do this. The problem, of course, is that land tax has a rising scale, a rising marginal land tax rate in most states. And so if you're a corporate landlord with 1,000 apartments, you pay the highest rate of land tax. But if you're 1,000 different dentists and surgeons with one apartment each, you pay the lowest land tax. And you've got your other income, it's negatively geared in the meantime. And so, build to rent is all about evening up those taxes, right? But instead of raising the land tax on everyone to even it up, we decided to reduce it on these large build-to-rent property owners instead. So, there is a political game going on in the background here, most certainly. Now, is that a bad thing for the economy as a whole and for the housing market? It's hard to say, right? It depends where you raise taxes elsewhere to make that up. It depends on the quality of the buildings. It depends how fast they go. But I have this example that I like to share. When people say build to rent's going to be an affordability solution, and I say, well, it's another option for a way to structure ownership of property. But is it affordability solution? Because at the Gold Coast, which hosted the Commonwealth Games in 2018, they built the Athletes Village for that Games. It was financed by the Abu Dhabi Council of their sovereign wealth fund. And it took them 4 years to then rent that out, drip feeding the rental properties into the market at the end of the Games because they didn't want to flood the market, right? They didn't want rents to go down. And now rents there are 50% higher than they were when they first started renting them out. So, this idea that having corporate landlords creates different economic incentives in terms of the price or the rental price, I think is very oversold. Yes, there might be more tenant security, but of course, a corporate landlord has the sort of management capacity to definitely raise the rent, kick you out, find someone new much quicker, right? It hasn't stopped rents being raised at the existing build-to-rent projects. And of course, if you can't pay the higher rent, then you must leave. Now, that's not kicking you out because mum and dad sold their investment property, but it's effectively the same because they're ratcheting up the rent. So I think it's oversold on a few dimensions. And I think politically, as you mentioned, there are going to be new interest groups created, which I don't think are particularly helpful in the long run.
And talking about that, it's interesting that SQM's most recent vacancy rate data came out, and they're saying it went down again, so 1.1% vacancy rate across the place. And certainly my analysis suggests that the amount of available rental property has continued to drop through the floor. Now, I guess one of the questions on that is that because we've got a lot more people coming into the country? Migration, of course, is dramatically high. Is it that we've got less affordability, so people are unable to perhaps get into the mortgage part of the market because it's more difficult? Is it a confluence of all of those things that have actually created this horrendous situation where many people cannot find anywhere to rent? Or if they do, what they have to do is to rent a long way from where they're working, so they're spending a long time traveling, or have to pay very, very high rents just to get anywhere. I mean, this to my mind is another signal of a broken market.
Yeah, I guess I have a slightly different view to most people on rents and rental vacancy. And I think your point is correct that, the high migration is not helping, but let me address that in a moment. First, I sort of want to be clear that so rental vacancy doesn't mean empty properties. So the rental vacancy numbers from SQM and CoreLogic are the number of advertised rentals, right? So they're rental advertisement numbers. Yeah. And so they give a good indication of what's going on in the market, right? Because pretty much you've got to advertise to get a new tenant. So it's a bit like job ads or something, right? And it's not that low vacancy causes rising prices. It's that rising demand jointly causes low vacancy and rising prices, because low vacancy and rising prices are the same thing. They are a symptom of a market adjusting. And that market can adjust in two ways. One is through higher incomes of households. So, for example, if we gave every household in the country a 20% bonus to their income somehow, in a hypothetical, this year, we would see rents rise and vacancy rates fall with no change in the stock of dwellings or the number of people, right? But because we are going to adjust to a higher rent, lower vacancy is how that happens. You can also get the same thing if there's more money from more people, right? So it's not the people, but it's their incomes. And so the high migration currently is having that effect. We've got more people with more money trying to squeeze in houses. So we have a similar adjustment going on. Now, at the end of this adjustment, we will probably be back to where we've been for nearly a century or more, which is that households in the private rental market who don't rely on welfare for their income pay basically 20% of their after-tax income on rent as a median, right? So the typical private household pays 20% of their income. Now, that's the same number in 1993, 2003, 2023, and it's, the historical records show it wasn't too much different in 1903 and 1923 either. So all those adjustments will take place, and that's sort of where we'll get to. So I have a bigger sort of high-level sort of model in my mind of the rental market where low vacancy and rising rents are the same thing, adjusting to higher demand. That demand is a product of more money, whether that's more income from households or more households with more income. And we've seen the same pattern play out, not just in Australia, but in the United States, where immigration is not as high, but they did a lot of stimulus and they've had good growth. And so advertised rents increased 16% year on year if you were in the US 12 months ago, but 0% year on year in the last 12 months. And that's pretty much the same as Australia, but about 8 to 12 months ahead of us. And we're seeing that in Canada, we're seeing that in Germany. The people are voting to nationalize corporate landlords in Germany, right? That's how much rents have adjusted and triggered political backlash. So so on the migration now, to get further into detail, the effect of that is very real, and it's puzzles me in some ways that it's not just Australia, but Canada and even the UK that have had such an enormous post-COVID migration boom. And I don't know if that was engineered, politically desired, whether it was thought to be a good way to insulate the economy from an inevitable downturn after COVID, but it's happening everywhere. And I see that as a temporary, an additional temporary effect on households and household income on the rental market, but I think it will wash through within a couple of years. So, and I have a few reasons for that, but basically rapid changes to migration have large but temporary effects. And we're seeing that as a partial contribution to the rental price adjustment that's happening. So that's my sort of big picture take on that.
And let me just add to that, because I think there's another factor to bear in mind. With high migration, there are more people coming into the country who need jobs. That potentially means that you're going to have to create many more jobs to keep the unemployment rate roughly where it is. And if you're unsuccessful in that, then you'll see the unemployment rate rise. And of course, if you've got higher unemployment, it is absolutely going to hit people with mortgages in particular, and those in the rental sector too. So I think that second order effect is, for me, the most significant, right? High migration, 500,000 plus, is going to lift the unemployment rate probably.
Look, just as it, how do I put it? It's almost the inverse to houses, right? So you can think of the vacancy rate as the unemployment rate for houses, right? So boosting demand for houses, and you can think of the effect of migration having the opposite effect. It's sort of boosting the supply of labor in that market. It's definitely a risk. I mean, the spending requirements to accommodate high migration will definitely, change what we end up spending money on in the next little while. But it is a real political puzzle, I think, and a real perversion in a way of the left and right of politics, that it's almost the right that's now talking about this and saying, oh, maybe this is having a large, maybe but temporary effect on housing, and the left is like, no, ignore it. The more the merrier. And I think there is a moderate, sensible, in-between position, which is, it's more like the early 2000s rates of migration rather than the higher 2010s and the crazy high current rates. Might optimize everybody's taste for, looking after opportunities for people in other countries to come while protecting opportunities for people already here. And you just don't get a moderate debate on this topic. It's very wild, and politically it's polarized, and in the media it's also polarized. So you have The Guardian and the ABC won't touch it, and then you have maybe Sky News and the Australian that will. It's a real puzzle, Martin, and I don't think there's another level of understanding I think I can reach here, because the average person on the street is happy to talk about it, right? A lot of people I talk to who I would never have expected to say, housing's pretty tight right now. Pretty weird that we're having record high migration and no one's pointing this out when everyone's trying to squeeze into this 1% of vacant rental properties. Not just the people leaving rental properties, but everyone else arriving is trying to squeeze in. It's a bit of a weird one. But just a final little maybe clarifying point on this is that when we count people and we count dwellings, as is sort of popular when we talk about this topic, there are these things called purpose-built student accommodation. So they're essentially rooms with no individual bathroom or kitchen. They're just sort of boarding houses for hundreds of students with shared common kitchens and toilets and facilities. Now, these are not counted in dwelling statistics. So when we have dwelling counts from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, it counts private dwellings, but it doesn't count the number of beds in these non-private or institutional sorts of accommodations. And there are something like 120,000 of these. So part of what's happened since COVID is that these non-private dwellings have soaked up some of those extra students. So I guess I'm just trying to moderate people's sort of thoughts on the scale of the issue with a bit of extra information on that one.
No, that's very interesting. And in fact, the whole debate about how much property is around and how much is vacant is actually a very important debate to have, isn't it? Particularly now. I mean, the census last year showed well over 1 million, maybe 1.2 million properties. And when you actually parse that out, you've got some Airbnb, you've got some that are clearly second homes. There are some that are actually, people in transition, but there also do seem to be a runt at least that's actually deliberately left vacant. And if you look at the vacancy distribution, take Melbourne, the Docklands area, there are a lot of units there that have never been lived in and are held deliberately vacant. So this is a really important aspect, I think, in this whole question of the property market, supply and demand.
Yeah. Look, that's true. So I guess any large new project is going to, as I said about the build to rent at the Gold Coast, the Commonwealth Games Athletes Village, it had 1,200 dwellings. And so if for 3 years, it had about 500 of them empty, right? Those ones that were leased in the last year out of the 4-year lease-up period. And the manager of that project emailed me and said, well, we're on a staged release strategy, so we don't flood the rental market. We'll be releasing the next building in 12 or 18 months. It's the logical thing to do. And that's why Docklands, for example, usually has the highest vacancy when you measure it as water use. For example, an apartment that's had no water use for 12 months. But yeah, those million dwellings, they're not empty and unused. They have a variety of uses, as you say, holiday homes, occasional B&B, Airbnbs, new but not yet rented. And that buffer of dwellings is why during COVID we could all spread out around the country, right? We could do that by filling up these underutilized sort of buffer stock of dwellings in the market. And I think what we're going to see as part of the adjustment to the high migration right now is a reversal of that. So more people living together, but instead of those dwellings being vacant, having new people move in, right? So we're going to reconsolidate back as a new adjustment process. But yeah, it is notoriously difficult to measure dwellings. And I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, since you raised it. One of my sort of frustrations is that a lot of people think it's easy to measure how many people there are, right? How many dwellings there are. Like it's not, right? So in Queensland, it's very common to raise your house and build it downstairs because the houses are on stumps. Well, if you rent downstairs separately to upstairs, is that 2 dwellings or 1 dwelling? Because we've got maybe 2 households because it's rented separately, or 1 dwelling, or is it 2 dwellings because 2 households say it? So typically what you do for dwelling counting is you rely on self-declared information. So when the census comes out, the people downstairs say, oh, 3 of us live downstairs. That's 3 people, 1 dwelling. And 2 of us live upstairs. Well, they fill theirs out, 2 people, 1 dwelling. It becomes 2 dwellings. So yeah, it's really not as easy as you think. Half finished, new, renovated, these holiday rentals, it's not just Airbnb, but holiday rentals we've had for a long time. Are they dwellings? I mean, yeah, you can live in them, but they're basically private hotels. Defining the boundary is very difficult. So I just wanted, anyone listening to just be aware that, precision is not assured.
No. I mean, this whole situation is based on rubbery numbers left, right, and centre. And it's partly a definitional question. It's partly a timing question. So, the census from 2 years ago is now out of date because of the migration and everything else. And the fact
we've got a million more people, basically.
Yeah, and we've built a whole new lot of properties on the outskirts of our towns that aren't in the census numbers. So that's part of the problem with trying to sort of... Yeah. In my surveys, I have to try and optimize my models consistently based on what I understand to be the latest developments that are in train. But it's a very rubbery science rather than anything else.
Yeah. Right? Well, I mean, I think the way I see it is, it's really, really hard to get a precise number. But if you take the same methodology and the same implementation and you do it repeatedly, right? The change over time still has a lot of information in it, right? Because you're using the same measure. Now, you might be, biased down 15%, but that bias is consistent with your methodology, and you're using the same methodology. So it's a bit like the CPI. It's a bit like all of these economic measures. The levels are very hard to compare with long periods of time and with other countries, but the short and medium term trends are very informative. So that's sort of where the information comes from, these imperfect measures. You can sort of get better information than what we can measure by doing the same thing consistently.
Absolutely. Well, of course, that's what I do with my mortgage stress analysis. So I've used the same modelling right the way from the year 2000 all the way through. And so it's the rate of change in stress. Whether you agree with the methodology or not, it's the change, it's the delta V that actually is so significant. And of course, when you see the rental stress going through the roof at 70% of households and mortgage stress now more than 0.5% of households, that tells you something relative to where we were some time previously.
Yeah, look, it's one thing the media doesn't do well, I think. Put that change over time in context and just say, oh, today's number is this. Because, you need a news headline, right? But I think if we all took that approach of looking at consistent data sets and the trends, I think we'd have a lot better context to really understand what we're looking at for sure.
Now, Jason asked an interesting question, which was this. Do you think the vacancy tax and others may make investors seek to leave empty for appreciation will change anything, or is it just another cash grab? Not solving anything.
Yeah. I've been digging into this quite a lot recently because in Canada, there's British Columbia has a vacant homes tax, an empty dwellings tax. They also have an Airbnb registry, and you've got to pay a fee to do that. So the best analysis in Canada had that, 20,000 additional dwellings were brought into private rental through the imposition of the vacancy tax. And the vacancy tax was actually very oppressive for foreign owners. So I think from memory, don't quote me on the number, but it was something like 80% of the revenue from the tax came from the foreign owner tax, which was much higher than the local owner tax. And they estimate something like 20,000 dwellings returned to the rental pool, which might be about half of those that were demonstrated to be vacant. But that's only, it's less than 1% of the number of dwellings in the province, and 1% in the stock, doesn't really change anything significantly when it comes to rents. Like, yes, if you all rented that on one weekend, there'd be a sharp adjustment. But if you dribble those back into the rental market over 3 years, it's barely noticeable. A good rule of thumb is that a 1% change in the number of total dwellings, so there's 11 million basically in Australia, a 1% change in the total reduces rents by 1%. But it might be less than that because we reallocate into bigger homes and we get 1% more square meterage per person on average, and we pay the same price. So it could also be a quantity adjustment as well. Like we pay the same price, we just get 1 square meter extra, or 1% of the area on average. So these aren't huge effects. The revenue is significant. And I mean, if you are having a separate debate, not about housing, but ways to raise revenue that don't have perverse economic effects, then yeah, okay, it's a good way to do it. And if you can manage and administer it simply and without too much cost, then fine. I'm not against raising revenue. And I'm also not worried about people selling these vacant homes. Like, great, someone else will do something different with it, either pay the vacancy tax or rent it out. That's no big deal either. So from the housing question, yeah, it's a very, very small change in terms of rents and prices and the available stock. On the revenue side, it's a good way to raise revenue. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, maybe it's overcomplicating things. I don't know. But I don't have a super strong view, but that's sort of the trade-offs I see.
Yeah, interesting. And in fact, Bossman asked this question: can the investor write off the state tax as a cost? Presumably they can, because it's as a business, isn't it? So effectively all the inputs and outputs as a business would actually be netted off, and the total returns or losses.
Yeah, I think that's true of state land taxes. Yep. Can be deducted from federal income taxes, right? So yes. So the net effect, if you consolidate the governments, the council rates, the state and the federal as one thing, I mean the net effect is much lower. Yep. In terms of total tax revenue. That's for sure.
Now, one other question which is worth just exploring. I was reading your Substack the other day on rent controls. So there was a big debate sometime previous about whether, in fact, the government should impose rent controls. The Greens were pushing it. In some other countries, there have been some initiatives to control rents. In Canberra, rents are more controlled than elsewhere around the country. And they've done quite a lot of work on this. So what's your take on the whole rent control question? And, does it actually solve anything, or does it create more issues?
It makes rents cheaper. I think that is the heart of the problem here, right? I also put out on Twitter a question for my followers. I said, is it better if rents go up or down? Right? I'm like, let's really just get to the heart of this housing question. And still 18% of them said it's better that rents go up. I'm like, who are these people that I've been communicating
with? Investors, right?
Well, yeah, it turns out, 18% of Australian households are investors, right? But that's sort of a fundamental question you've got to get over first. Now, if your answer to that question is it better if rents go down? Then yes, rent controls work, right? That's why landlords don't like them. If rent controls didn't work, right, landlords wouldn't be upset at all. And if they backfired, like some say they do, oh, it's going to raise prices and rents in the future, well, landlords should lobby for it, right? Because just like they buy a property today at a loss, negatively gear, in the hope of a future gain, well, rent control, take a small loss today for a big gain in the future. That's great. We should, it's free money from the government. But they don't, right? So that says to me it works. Now, the issue, the administrative issue with rent control, so let me back up a second. So in terms of making rents cheaper, yes, it makes rents cheaper, and that comes at a dollar for dollar cost to landlords. And therein lies that economic conflict. And the same thing I talked about earlier with build to rent, right? Same deal. They don't want rent control either. The administrative complexity comes because the market rent doesn't disappear just because the rent is controlled in certain dwellings within the market, right? So if you have some people who've stayed at a particular place for a few years and the market rents move 20%, they're paying 20% less, that market rent still exists. And if they move out, the next person's willing to pay the market rent because that's their next best option. So you need some kind of either you temporarily control by just having a maximum rate that rents can go up during a tenancy, or you have to have some kind of government clearinghouse that says, well, rents are fixed here. If people want to swap, you have to come to me. I will do those swaps for you and reallocate you back to those discounted properties, like public housing just about. And in fact, that's what happened after the First World War in Austria, when rents were fixed at their 1918 levels for about 15 years. They had a central public clearinghouse. So if you wanted to move, you had to go there and say, I want to give up my 2-bedroom unit on this part of town because I've got 5 kids now. Can I have a bigger one? And they would swap you and they would pay the same rent to the landlord. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying it's a tricky administrative problem to get cheap housing by regulating the rent of a million different landlords. One, moderate step you could take is to limit how quickly rents can rise during a tenancy and peg that limit to a local index. Now, that's what Canberra has, but it's a soft limit. So if the tenant agrees, they can put the rent up higher. In the Netherlands, it's a CPI plus 3%. So if your landlord tries to put it up, you have the right to say, no, you can only put it up at this rate. If you want to put it up, 15%, you can't do it in 1 year, you've got to do it over 2 years. I think that's a fair thing to do. And one reason why I think that's fair is because everyone likes their cash flows smoothed out. In Queensland and New South Wales, landlords who pay land tax get their land tax smoothed out over time. So instead of, if the land values rise 20% in a year, as they can do, instead of paying 20% more land tax or more because there's a rising marginal rate of tax, the states in Queensland and New South Wales say, oh, we don't want to, impose these unexpected changes in cash flow. What we'll do, we'll average 3 years land value and you'll pay tax on the average. So if land price is $1 million and then it jumps to 1.5, we're not going to increase your land tax 50% in 1 year. We'll increase it by 1/6 over 3 years, 1/6 a year for 3 years to get it to that 50% increase. So I think if it's good enough for that, then it's probably good enough for sitting tenants. The issue, of course, is that implementing a control like that now is very difficult because rents have already shot up. So it's almost like the policy debate comes just too late because it responds to the market and the market moves in cycles. So just after rents go up, we go, oh, now we're going to enact this new rent regulation when it won't even, have any effect for the next 5 years because rents won't go up. It's come in too late. But that's fine. Maybe that's a politically opportune time to do it. So that's my view. I think there's a moderate middle ground that is common internationally, that seems to work well and that insulates tenants from sudden spikes, but doesn't come with the administrative costs or the administrative problem of reallocating homes where the market price and the rent control price differ.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think with all of these things, people are grasping at solutions almost to solve yesterday's problem. rather than actually thinking
Yeah.
ahead, right? There is nothing that I see where longer term planning, thinking about future demand for property, the infrastructure that's required to support that property, land and roads and everything, right? It's like we sort of just build stuff and then try and sweep up the mess afterwards. I mean, is that just the way the free markets will always be, or is it actually a policy choice or a policy failure? What do you think?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, in some ways, you could argue that's the good part of free markets. Like when people want to buy houses, people who own land start building more houses, and when people don't, they do other things, or they, put a paid parking lot on their empty lot, right? So yeah, I think it's probably a bit of both. I think, my personal best way to navigate this whole housing conundrum is to have a much broader public option for ownership. Whereas you don't regulate rents in the private market, you don't tax people to change the value of their biggest asset, and you say, hey, 66% of people are homeowners, go for it. Lots of people in the rental market, you'll be quite satisfied. But just like in healthcare, schools, public roads, and parks, we go, hey, but there's a public option here for you as well. And so, I think that's the way to navigate it. And if I look historically, which I did for my book, The Great Housing Hijack, which comes out in February next year, the only real examples of major changes to housing cost for renters or new buyers is major public investment and major public alternative systems, whether that's home ownership, public home ownership in Singapore, where you can, as a 21-year-old Singaporean resident, apply as a couple for a massively discounted off-the-plan apartment from the government, and go and get use your superannuation to pay your mortgage. Why not do that? So I've proposed a scheme called Housemate, which is essentially the Aussie version of that. And it's essentially go and just build houses all through the capital cities and the major regional areas and just offer them for sale at a discount to people who don't own property. So if the rental market's not working for them or rents change quickly, they can escape. It's like an escape valve, a pressure valve. And I think those are they're not easy. It's not easy for the public sector to do things anymore. It's going to take a lot of trial and error, but we trust the public sector to build roads and do everything, right? For new housing, it's pretty much everything until the front fence. And then we go, the public sector doesn't know how to build houses. Everything on the other side of the fence, you guys have to build us a road. Now you have to build us a sewer. Now you have to fix the stormwater. Build us a park, do that. Well, we can do all that, but maybe if we had many years of practice, we could also just pump out some reasonable quality houses to give people that option. And I think anything else that is really about engineering rents and prices in the private market is going to be such a tough political sell, right? It's electorally difficult. 66% of people are homeowners. Who's going to go out there and say, yeah, I'm going to tax property to make the price come down? Or who's going to talk rent control? The Greens sort of, they tried to talk about it, but I think they got essentially no traction outside of their inner core of supporters. So I think, hey, let the private market do the way it wants. Sometimes it's the Wild West. Sometimes prices adjust really quickly. Sometimes there's boom and bust construction cycles and price cycles. But if you've got this pressure release valve, then people aren't trapped into that. That's where my thinking's gone.
Absolutely. Well,
public sector doesn't know how to administer public spaces. I can read that comment. Well, I mean, they do though, right? Olympic Games, casinos, parks, roads, hospitals. We just have this weird lens when it comes to houses. We go, I can't do that. But then we expect perfection on everything else. Yeah, build us that. We need a new highway here. You can do that. Okay. So I can build a highway and not that public servants build the highways, but manage the contracts and manage the project and acquire the land. Like, it's routine in so many areas. And in housing, it's just not, for some reason. And I'm not saying we're going to instantly do it and your average public servant's going to be great at it. I'm saying if we did it repeatedly, we'd get good. Let me give you an example. In New Zealand, they started a thing called Kiwi Build a few years ago. It was a bit of a flop at first. They couldn't really do it very well. They couldn't get land in. They sort of ran out of money. They were sort of obliged to cover their costs, so they weren't really subsidized, yet they were trying to be cheap. So that was really difficult. Then once they realized, no, we're just going to pump out housing and it's okay, we're going to cover some subsidies, they were building houses in 90 days. And they said it was actually, once we got our act together and had the capability, we could get all the right consultants, contractors in the room and say, let's see what didn't work last time and how we're going to fix it for the next one. And so there's some good news stories there as well, but it's not instant. It's like any business, any private business, it takes a while to learn. So I'm as cynical as the next person, and I'm as cynical about the perverse interests, and I'm as cynical about incentives in the public service at times and the influence of politics. But there's just a lot of areas in Australia where we do have really functional public institutions, and I don't know why housing can't be part of that mix.
Right, absolutely. And I think, sometimes the truth is that the ambition which should be there isn't there because people say, oh, it can't possibly work. Well, maybe give it a try, right?
Well, I mean, yeah. I'm not even sold that the private sectors can, tender for these projects, right? They can go, oh, I've got this 12-stage subdivision. Will you guys buy this stage from me at a discount so I can get some people in here, some young families to, enliven my community and make my next stage worth more in the private market? I'm totally okay with that. It's, it doesn't have to, whatever works. That's my attitude.
That's fair enough. Now, one other question which I wanted, and this touches perhaps into the broader issue of politics and power, right, is land banking. Now, land banking, of course, is the very strong trend where you have entities, mostly corporate entities, not exclusively, who bought land a long time ago and then drip feed it in or don't drip feed it in. And it's interesting how when the political context changes, suddenly land banking seems to, we got plenty of land now, whereas suddenly we didn't, whereas previously we didn't. So it's not so obvious. And then you realize that there's a whole political and power structure around this land banking stuff, which actually is setting a lot of the agenda.
Well, exactly. Property owners who own undeveloped land have an asset, and they want to build as much as they can on it, but whenever it suits them, right? It is funny, these build to rent, to circle back again to the build to rent, I do find it funny that all these same developers and organizations that have said, oh, we don't have any land, government's got to release land, have turned around and go, oh, I've got all this spare land. Can we do some build to rent? Can you give me a tax break? I'm like, well, do you have spare land or do you not have spare land? Because you just told me you don't have any to build for sale, but now you're telling me you got some for build to rent. And another example that comes to mind is Lend Lease, who's one of the biggest property developers, now sort of multinational, but originally Australian. They are selling their communities division right now. So they're trying to sort of consolidate their balance sheet a little. And they have 40,000 undeveloped housing lots on their balance sheet, and they're selling them right now. And I actually I spoke to Max Chandler-May, the Greens member. He's my Greens member, because he was pushing about the Housing Future Fund. He's like, no, just build houses with it. Just give it to the state public housing bodies and they'll build houses. And I said, why don't you negotiate and say, we'll agree as long as the fund buys the Lend Lease communities business and the 40,000 housing lots and all the employees and overheads that go with it, and then just pump those out. They're approved, they're ready to go. You've got the human resources and capabilities. Go and do it. But that didn't quite fly. So yeah, you're totally right that land banking is, I think it's a funny word. I like it in some ways because it just shows you that land is like like putting money in the bank. You own it because you don't want to spend the money. You own it because you want it in the bank for later in the future, right? And so all undeveloped land is a land bank of sorts, right? It's just that some is closer to development than others. And anyone who's got undeveloped land has a choice of, well, develop today or develop tomorrow. And there's an optimal rate today, so you don't undercut your profits tomorrow. And I call that the absorption rate, and that's essentially the economic regulator of new supply. So when demand's rising quickly, everyone wants to build because you're not undercutting tomorrow's prices. When demand falls, pardon me, you stop building, because if you try and sell too much today, you're undercutting tomorrow's price. And in fact, I would even argue, for example, in Spain after the financial crisis, when half-finished projects were demolished instead of rented out or sold, that was almost saying the optimal rate is negative. Like, we've got to get rid of, we've got too many houses. It's better to have fewer. A little bit like the vacancy issue again, there are just so many houses, it's not worth putting this one in the queue. So yeah, land banking is a funny one, and when the market turns, you'll just be surprised how many houses there are and how much land is for sale all of a sudden that people think is now much riskier to hold, and they want to palm it off onto someone else to hold. It does raise the question, of course, of can we use the magic of tax incentives to get landowners to build faster? And that's something I've thought about a lot. And I think at the end of the day, I've come down on the side of, well, yeah, land value taxes are good taxes and they raise money and they're efficient, but they're not going to get property owners to just flood the market and almost panic build or overbuild, because the trades of land will get us back to the equilibrium. And and the way I think that through is, well, if you tax land banks and the property owner says, no, I'm not building because it's unprofitable and I'm not paying your tax, it's unconstitutional, whatever they want to do, eventually you're going to acquire that land to recover the tax bill. And I just figure, why not buy land and build houses directly if that's the ultimate fallback position of a sort of tax designed to accelerate development out of undeveloped land. So that's sort of where I get to on that. But yeah, land banking is definitely, it's funny. It's denied by the big property owners when it comes to policy conversation, and it's bragged about when it comes to their conversations with investors about how they've secured their pipeline and how they don't have to worry about land for 40 years because they've secured all these sites. I'm like, well, which is it? Are you waiting 40 years to build, like you tell your investors, or is there no land and land banking's a myth? Pick one.
Yeah, and just to build on that, the other observation is, of course, those large entities have huge lobbying power with governments, both federal and state, and down to the council level. So in a way, some of the decisions that are taken or not taken, I think around planning and those sorts of things, are also off the back of very, very heavy intervention from those very powerful entities.
Yeah, I mean, that's a topic in my book, Rigged, How Networks of Powerful Mates Rip Off Everyday Australians. People probably know the first version of that book under the title Game of Mates. So Rigged is the expanded, revised, updated 2022 version. And yeah, that's classic, right? Like large landowners. In that period when you own land but don't redevelop it, where there's lots of different options for you, one option is to change the rules or lobby to have the rules changed so that when you do develop, you can do a more profitable alternative. And of course, there's a large incentive for that. Now, yes, I did some analysis getting on like 8 years ago, where I looked at the social networks of property owners who are inside and outside rezoned land. and I scraped records of property ownership, of who's on corporate boards for corporate ownership, personal databases of politicians, donor databases, lobbyists and their client databases. And through that network that I created, it had something like 250,000 relationships and 12,000 entities. I was able to predict who got inside the upzoning and who was just next door or across the road and didn't get upzoned. And you could easily predict where that boundary was drawn by the social network of the property owner. And I could also work out that those inside got $750 million of additional land value in the first year from the change in property rights granted by that. So it's a huge deal. And I think the solution to that is not, it's very hard to stop people being networking with each other and being influential. But what is very easy to do is to price the value, right? So just like, if I own a property and I can build a 5-story building, but if I could build 10 stories, I'd make more money, right? Now, if I'm a government, I can give you the air, that cube that's in the air, for free through planning changes. But a different way to build that same building would be to get the block next door, say a public park, right? And so I could build 5 stories here and 5 stories in the park, right? So no one would say, yeah, you should give them the park so they can build more houses for free. Yet when it's airspace, we go, oh, no, that's just in the air. That's not worth anything. Just give it to them for free. Whereas economically, no, it's just the same. It's the property right to build 5 stories. This cube happens to be at a different elevation to this cube, but it's still got a market value. We can still price it. We can still sell it. In fact, that person you give it to for free, if it was tradable, could sell it to someone else, such as in the New York air rights, tradable air rights regulations. So I think if you price those sorts of gains, from these planning decisions, then 2 things happen. 1, there's less incentive to lobby because it's not worth so much. And 2, even if you're good at lobbying, you're still contributing to the public purse for your success. And I think as a general policy matter, I think people are a lot happier when change happens in the neighborhood, when it doesn't look like it's a giveaway for someone for free, when it seems like, oh, we're all going to benefit from that. Oh, you're going to get all this money and then you're going to spend on, oh, okay, well, it probably sounds good. So I think that's where a better solution lies.
I can just hear all of those big developers saying, what? No!
Look, to be honest, I think that you could find some developers who would be comfortable with this, because they're sort of competing with more influential developers in the neighborhood as well, right? So there are going to be a group of property owners and upstart developers and people who aren't as well connected who'd be like, actually, that'd be really reasonable, right? To give me a chance. I don't mind paying if it's an extra $80,000 per apartment or $100,000, but I can't get it. Whereas, the well-connected can. So let's see. Look, there are experiments with similar things. Victoria's introducing a windfall gains tax. The ACT has this type of value capture, it's called, charge. Sydney had it for one electoral cycle at the beginning of the 1970s, and then all the rural landowners got upset and voted out the same government that brought it in. So again, it's contentious because it takes back a freebie, but I think the fact that it's been entrenched in the ACT and seems like Victoria's going to get theirs passed means it's possible.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, as we come towards the end of the show, one other topic I just wanted to touch on briefly, and it goes back to your older book, the the one about mates and power and those sorts of things. We have a Western Australia leader who leaves and then basically takes 4 jobs. We have an ex-treasurer who's now chairman of one of the major investment banks in Australia. We have an ex-defence minister who went off into the defence. We seem to find this revolving door between the politicians and big business. And I guess my question is this okay or is it not okay? And why do we put up with it?
Yeah, Australia is definitely like that. Yeah, the is it Mark McGowan, the former Western Australia Premier? Um, that was a really interesting one because he said he was exhausted and he had to retire, and he took up four jobs: one at a lobbyist group, two strategic advisor roles in the mining sector, and yeah, it. I'm not even surprised by this sort of thing anymore. It's totally expected. I think perhaps um, there are ways to minimize this type of behavior. And I mean, there's few ways to think about it. One is there's the behavior of the revolving door. Okay, there's the behavior of the revolving door. And then there's the outcome of the decisions that are influenced because of these networks. And there's two ways to attack it. One is to make it more difficult to form networks, make it more difficult to work in these areas after politics or before politics or whatever the case might be. And the other way to do it is make government decision making less consequential for those who benefit, right? So it's a little bit like the charging for upzoning, making, government decisions more competitive, the tendering process for government contracts, making sure that even if you have a lobbyist, even if you have your former premier working for you, even if they influence the decision, they still have to go through a competitive process. Maybe there's some kind of like independent panel selection. Maybe you got to pay for at an auction for a particular thing. So you can minimize the cost to us, and then you can minimize the operation of the game of mates. And I think you can probably do a little bit of both. On the operation of the game of mates, we used to have generous political retirement packages, right? Lifetime, I think former prime ministers get a driver for their lifetime or whatever it was. But then in the early 2000s, we wound back these entitlements for former politicians without, I think, asking the question, why did we have such generous entitlements? Was it just they were selfish and gave it to themselves? Or was it that we had this bigger picture issue that if a politician's well set up in retirement, then you can more easily enforce limits on the type of commercial and business activity they can do, right? Because if you don't pay them, they go, oh, I used to be a lawyer and now I'm going to be a lawyer again. I can take any clients I want. I've got expertise in mining and Western Australian law. Why shouldn't I work here? Well, you shouldn't work there because we gave you a generous retirement package so that you wouldn't. And now we're going to enforce things. And if we're suspicious about you using your former position for influence, we can also prosecute other rules that we might come up with. So I think I think we've lost a little bit of focus on some of the more traditional mechanisms we had in place to minimize the lobbying prowess of former politicians. So I think we've gone a little bit too commercial in the way we think about politicians. So that's certainly one way to do it. I mean, another way is to institutionalize, and this is sort of mixing the two ideas, institutionalize sort of independence in decision making. So even if you lobby the government, we're going to actually have randomly draw from a jury or a pool of public servants who the decision makers are. So by adding the randomness, it minimizes the benefit to being a mate and having a connection because you're not sure which decisions or when or if they'll ever get to make a decision. And so, I don't think there's a right answer. It's 2023, and I don't think any civilization solved this. Australia's still very rich and prosperous and functional, but I think it's, as you say, situations like this definitely should attract more attention than they do because our political structures can degrade very quickly when we're not paying attention in terms of giving out favours, wasting public resources on very useless things because they're politically favourable to certain groups. That happens, I think, faster than we realise, and like anything, we sort of take for granted the way things work. And I hope more attention to situations like this get a little bit more focus. I hope that perhaps in a few years' time, if a former premier did this, they'd be much more embarrassed. And the businesses that employed them would be more embarrassed because the public expectation has increased. But we will see. Who knows?
Don't hold your breath on that one. Okay, last topic for this evening. The Voice happened over last weekend, and of course the No side, came up on top. Now, I don't want to talk about the decision, but what I want to talk about is the focus that the political machine has had over the last 9 months plus around the Voice. And the question that I've got is, has it actually sucked so much oxygen out of the room that we've actually missed other things that should have been more focused over the last few months? In other words, was there a set of political decisions being made here as to why this was run at this particular time? What do you think?
Well, there's always a political reason for why and when to do things. I don't know. Look, I don't have any major insight into this particular case or why the Labor Party thought it would be good politics. However, as a general rule, it's certainly good politics if you have other concerns to focus people's minds on something like this, right? All those columns written about the Voice in the newspaper were not written about immigration and whether we should have a public debate about 500,000 people per year, or inflation, or other public investments, or schools and hospital waiting lists, or you name it, right? Public housing, although that's kind of been popular. But every column written about the Voice wasn't written about something else. And so the cynical side of me is always thinking, well, did the government think this would get up and it would win them votes at the next election because that's an incentive for them? Or did they just think it's a good, it plays to their base and breeds loyalty and say, look, we did this for you, now you guys owe us. But, I think in terms of the outcome, I think, it almost, for me, shows my faith in the average person sniffing out political nonsense, let's call it. Whether you support it or not, I don't think it was a well thought through proposal to put to a referendum. And I think that's what the electorate saw. And, to me, that almost shows there's a sort of gap between the debate that happens in the mainstream press and the rest of us, which I think a lot of people have observed over the last few years, that there are taboo topics like immigration, and then there's like obsessive topics like the Voice. And if you ask the people, then their interests are the exact opposite to what's being talked about in the paper. Someone's noting it was an election promise, and I think it's a mistake to think that those words have any political meaning, right? We say it's an election promise when we want to do it. We say it wasn't a real promise when we don't want to do it. People will flip and change politically. Just look at what they do, not what they say. That's the good rule of thumb.
So I've got this analogy, in the art of being a magician, right? It's called misdirection, right? So what you do is you get everyone to look over there, right, while you do something over here, and then it appears to be magic, right? Well, I would argue that the last 9 months has been full of misdirection. So there's been a huge amount of focus over here. And that issue is an important one, but it missed some of those other critical issues like immigration, and I could list a whole bunch of other ones. And I almost think it says to me that the current government doesn't really have the appetite to really tackle some of those structural issues that we know the economy is actually up against. They prefer to go over in some of the more softer targets, and they can get a few brownie points because it was a political promise, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, there are some critical questions that should have been being dealt with and weren't.
Yeah, look, I don't know exactly what those were that were being avoided. Pardon me. But we can see that the attraction of big business, right, to signing up for The Voice, I think you might have mentioned, was, well, it's a type of thing that keeps everybody happy, whereas genuine economic change typically comes with losers as well as winners. um, and picking those fights or negotiating your way through them politically is very hard. And you're right, this is a convenient misdirection for many of those harder tasks. And I don't know what the fallout will be politically for the Labor government. I don't know if people will just move on and forget it and go, yeah, look, referendums worked. We said no, nothing happened, next thing. Or whether they'll go, is this guy serious about anything, or is he going to do the next sort of, misdirection, as you say? Is he trying to weave his political magic and we're never going to get anything done? Perhaps that will be a reaction. But I'm not really sure. But I think I agree with your overarching point, Martin. I just don't know what we're being distracted from. I mean, I have my issues of concern. You have yours. All of mine involve, winners and losers, and some politically important ones at that. And they're very, very hard.
Yeah, and the point is there will always be winners and there will always be losers. But if you look over the last 10 or 15 years, my argument is that the winners have been big business, corporates. They're paying less tax than they were, whereas the losers are average households whose incomes have gone into reverse, whose cost of living have gone through the roof, who in real terms are going backwards and are now facing higher interest rates for quite a long period of time, inability to find somewhere to live, all of the housing issues. It's like we seem to have got a society and an economy which is biased towards the few that in your earlier book you said had all the power. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. No, we shouldn't. In fact, there's actually a few interesting charts. I'm not sure if you follow on Twitter, Dave. His surname will come to me. He does charts of the effect of changes in tax and welfare policy on households with different incomes over different governments. And what you find is at the very bottom, there's quite often increases in welfare that outpace inflation and various adjustments. And at the top end, you often find there's some tax breaks, at the top end. And you do find the middle income distribution, where the bulk of Australian households are, always seems to miss out. Like, we're not the little guy in terms of the lowest income household, but we are the majority of the working households in the country. And I think the stage 3 tax cuts might be the next one for that. Heavily biased up the income distribution. There's going to be a huge chunk of middle Australia missing out on that as well. I don't like this trend. I don't like, the fact that the very select few businesses have such influence on political decisions. But again, it's always good to check out the window, right? Australia is very rich. It's doing very well on most things. And if you look around the world, we are, so far ahead of many places. And I think we need to appreciate that, but also keep our eyes out at what better things are possible so that we keep going forwards and avoid going backwards for too long.
Absolutely right. Well, this is about potentiality, right? And I've always believed that there was a huge potential, particularly in Australia. Yet, unfortunately, sometimes that potential is not actually, harvested for the benefit of everybody, right? Rather than just a few, unfortunately.
Yeah. Look, there are a few successes along the way. Maybe I'll drop an example. Queensland last year in May announced in their state budget an increase in the royalty rate on coal. Now, it wasn't the average royalty rate. They just added a higher tier. So if the coal price in Aussie dollars went above 225, then you'd pay 30% marginal rate. And I think if it went above 300 and something, you'd pay a 40% marginal rate. And, this had the effect of like a super profits tax on coal in Queensland. And we raised $6 or $8 billion extra last year. And now there's a big hospital upgrade program and all sorts of things going on. And it worked really well because at the time, the coal miners had to tell their investors, oh, coal prices at record highs, we're making heaps of money, everything's great. But then tell the government, oh, we don't have any money, you can't raise the royalties when the coal price is $500 a ton. And that never played. And so that's, for example, quite a success, I think, considering how much Australia is biased towards minerals and coal in our economy. Sharing that wealth more broadly, it's going to free up taxing all those people in the middle of the income distribution elsewhere, right? So I think there are little successes along the way. Sometimes they come from the unexpected places. I never really thought this would just come on budget day unannounced in Queensland, and 2 months later, coal miners would have to start paying. And it's stuck around, and everyone seems to like it. I didn't see that coming, but I think it's a huge success.
Yeah, good example. And, bearing in mind that with bracket creep going on, and that means that, of course, people are paying more tax, so relatively more tax than they've ever paid at a time when the cost of livings are all over the place.
Yeah. That's global trend at the moment. Tax revenues in US, Australia, all-time highs because of inflation and because the economy boomed after all the stimulus and the opening up after COVID. Yeah. There's that bracket creep might catch a few people, especially since real incomes, once we get the last couple of years of inflation are, quite different. The nominal income you need for the same real spending is quite different this year compared to 2 years ago.
Which is why retail sales might be going up. But if you look at it, discretion is going down. People are having to spend more to buy the same things they bought last year. So, the truth is somewhat different. Cameron, we've come to the end of our time. If people want to find out more about you and your thinking, where are the best places to go?
The very best place is fresheconomicthinking.com. Put your email in there, get a weekly newsletter, any announcements of things I'm doing. My book, Rigged, How Networks of Mates Rip Off Everyday Australians, is on Amazon and everywhere else if you want to understand where I come from on the political favoritism topics. And next on Twitter, at Dr. Cameron Murray, you'll see me every day post charts and analysis there just to sort of sense check myself against my followers. So at Dr. Dr. Cameron Murray, all one word.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. Really enjoyed speaking with you about these important issues. You must come on the show again. Still plenty of things to explore, so we'll try and tee that up down the track. And I want to say thank you to everybody else who was watching. Doggy Cam, there we go. The doggy cam is on Vanessa. I saw you'd asked about it. So the dogs, well, they did move and did make a few noises, but they've gone back to sleep again now, which they often do when I'm busy chatting on the show. And in terms of next week, I've got Robbie Barwick coming on to talk specifically about some of the issues to do with cash and banks and closing branches and things like that. And the week after, Tony LeCantre is coming back on. So mark your diaries on those. I want to say thank you for spending some time with us this evening. Thanks for the super chat. Jason appreciated the super chat there. Thank you very much indeed, and thank for everybody else's contributions via super chat. And this is time to say goodbye for this night. See my other recorded shows over the next week. I'll be back this time next week. This is Martin North from Digital Fancy Leaks signing off. Cheerio.